But more and more we are returning to the office. So it's nice to have the technology behind us to do these things. So again, we've just got a few more people rolling in. I appreciate everyone's patience, and I'll probably just give it another minute before we really get the show on the road here. I hope that everyone's been doing well so far in this new year, and wherever you are in the world or in North America, that you're warm and you're not too cold. It's a cold couple of months at the beginning of the year. All right, let's carry on then. So thank you for joining us today, Spire and Going Beyond the CRM with my friend Derek Fitzpatrick from GoIntegrations. We're going to be talking about CRM and everything beyond sales that you potentially could be missing out on if you are using a CRM for sales already, or if you're not. And so as Derek kind of was talking about before while everyone was rolling in, Derek is the president and co-founder of GoIntegrations. GoIntegrations is a Spire integrated partner, and they provide a variety of different solutions that integrate into your Spire program. But today we're going to focus on the CRM and using it beyond that. My name is Katie Griffin. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Spire. I'm happy to be a part of such a great team. And I will be hosting a series of knowledge-based webinars every month. We're scheduled for every month, so hopefully that's going to carry out nicely throughout the course of the year. I don't have a crystal ball, but wish me luck, you guys. All right, so a little bit of housekeeping. You all came in through our Hubelo platform. Thank you for doing that. We're still using that platform. It's a remnant of all the virtual things that we've been doing over the last couple of years, but it does bring you into Zoom. And so here you are in a Zoom platform. You are muted and your cameras are off because this is more of a webinar style presentation today, podcast/webinar style. We do have our events listed at spiresystems.com under the events page, and I do invite you to take a look. We try to get as many of the events listed ahead of time for you so that you have time to commit to them and commit an hour of your time sharing that with us. Again, very much appreciative of that. But go ahead and check out our events page. There'll be more listings coming out shortly. If you are someone with a designation and you would like a certificate of attendance with 1 hour of CPD points, you can email me after the webinar and I will make sure that one gets out to you. We don't take questions and answers during this podcast style webinar. Please reserve any questions that you have on the topics that we're discussing for your Spire consultant. Many of them are in the audience here today, and they'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. If they're not in the audience today, they'll still be able to answer questions that you have, and I'm always happy to help them out if they need to. Moving right along. So our agenda today, going beyond sales in a CRM program. We're going to take a look at vendor relationship management. There's all kinds of alphabet soup: CRMs, ERMs, MRPs, ERPs, ABC, 1, 2, 3. There's all kinds of acronyms out there, but we are going to look at VRM, vendor relationship management within a CRM tool. We're going to look at customer service, right? How that affects the use of certain tools and your overall business performance, setting growth targets. We're going to be looking at rating scales to offer deeper insight into your data, really drawing meaningful insight from your data. We're going to be looking at improving your communications. We're going to talk a little bit about omnichannel selling, and there are all some great ideas. There's some Spire tips that I'm going to throw in there for you guys along the way. They're just tips. They're just suggestions. It's not rocket science, just some clever little things that maybe you have or have not thought about and you could elaborate on further with your consultant's help. All right, let's get things going. So vendor relationship management through a CRM tool. We traditionally think of a CRM as a sales tool, Derek. We've used it often to manage our pipelines, to do some weighted probabilities being, at different stages of a sales pipeline, the sale is a percentage closer to being closed. The weighted is the dollar value of the entire sale broken up over the phases and percentage. You get closer to that dollar. Nurturing sales, reminders to follow up with leads. If any of you are in sales out there, you know that the follow up is so important. To further, marketing, email drip campaigns, form fills, landing pages, and kind of automating all of that. We've talked about this before in different webinars that we've had, but today we're really going to put that aside for a minute and focus on the vendor relationship side of using a CRM. Now, Derek, you and I have had some conversations in preparation for our episode here today, and we've identified some common challenges that exist when businesses are dealing with their suppliers or they're dealing with their vendors. So, Derek, one of the things that we talked about was how really we're at the mercy of our suppliers. We're at the mercy of our vendors, when they're going to ship something, how they want to receive an order from us. So if one has a good DRM process in place, what would you say is, the answer to that? Like, what do you get from being at the mercy?
Yeah, well, I mean, by having a good VRM process in place, what you are really doing is gaining a little bit of independence. It gives you a little bit to, let's say, push back on your vendors if they start trying to direct terms or kind of put you in a box, so to speak. By understanding the relationship and controlling a little bit more of that, you gain a little bit more in that discussion.
Yeah, in a nice way, of course.
We're all very exactly,
nice to each other.
Yes, definitely not hostile. Absolutely not.
Be nice to each other for sure.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're always the last to know. We're the last to know for a price sale or a discount that maybe we could have had, or some of the news sometimes leads us to being the last to know. And so when we have a good process in place, what are we going to gain from always being the last to know? Like, what is the advantage to us there?
Well, I mean, I look at that similar to kind of anything, friendships, sales. I mean, if we want to keep it to a business perspective, the more you communicate, the more you engage and follow up and stay in contact with your vendors, better engagement, the more likely they are to also keep you in mind as promotions are coming out. The ones that you don't talk to, may also feel somewhat neglected, or don't feel you're as big of a priority on their, on their radar. So trying to get better engagement, trying to, communicate and stay in contact, similar to how you do with your customers, has a lot of added benefits to it.
Yeah, top of mind. Staying
Absolutely.
top of mind. Absolutely. I've noticed also that often there's those rigid terms kind of being at the mercy again, but with those rigid terms, depending on the industry that some of the businesses are in, the pricing can just be absolutely, unpredictable and volatile, really. There's certain materials out there that it's just so hard to stay on top of that. And so when you have a strong relationship with your vendors where you aren't the last to know, you've got that better engagement. Would you say that is to your advantage in terms of avoiding volatile pricing, avoiding these unknowns kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, by having that better engagement, it does, and building that rapport, it does kind of give you that ability to sometimes go back and say, hey, Bob, hey, Jim, can we possibly look at, better rates? We've been a loyal customer of yours for many years. Our, payments are always on time.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of, incentives could you possibly give us?
What could you do for me here? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the same thing comes with the next point that we see here on the screen, right? You're just getting improved service by having these better agreements in place and these more consistent communications that you have in place with your vendors. Another challenge is the inconsistencies that we see, whether it's due to volatile pricing or it's due to change of policy or it's due to needing to adapt. Our vendors have adapted to all the delays that exist throughout the supply chain these days. They've had to make all kinds of adaptations to how and where they sell their products. If you're not in the loop, that can be fairly inconsistent, wouldn't you say?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the more that you can communicate, the more that you stay in communication with your vendors, the less surprises or curveballs they're going to kind of throw at you, because you're going to see things coming, or you're going to be, again, in the loop on those discussions, because you're going to build relationships with your vendors the same as you do with your customers and the people on those within those companies that you engage with on a regular basis.
Yeah. So more predictability, being able to count on things, which helps when we talk about managing vendor budgets, which we're going to talk about a little later today.
Yes.
And ultimately reducing risk too, right? And risk management is a big part of vendor relationship management as well. I mean, in other ways throughout the company it is too, but taking less of a gamble and reducing the risk, being more predictable, again, helping to manage expenses. What other challenges? I mean, I noticed also, I think one of the last points here is high vendor turnover. We don't all buy the same thing from just one person, right? We may have multiple vendors. And so talk to me a little bit about how it's bettered when you have a strong VRM in place.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. A lot of times, you want to diversify your purchasing so that you are not tied to, or the success or failure of your business or your growth is not tied to an individual or to one company. So the more engagement, the more communications, the more discussions had, you also too get insight into where the vendor is going. Right? What they're doing. Are they bringing out new product lines? Building that, again, relationship where you are trying to work as a team, right? And not just being seen as the customer, but really an extension of their team to help them further their agenda, in turn can also definitely help you with yours. And, it should all go hand in hand.
And I think all these points go hand in hand, right? So some of these are challenges that we've identified in dealing with your vendor relationships. These are some of the benefits that you get when you have a stronger VRM process and tools in place, right, Derek? It's not just about the processes that you have. You can have all kinds of great, processes, but if you're lacking the ability to do those in any kind of tool, that's problematic, right?
Absolutely.
So we're going to take a look now just at some Spire tips for organizing vendor information. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to jump into Spire. I do have some screenshots just because there's a bit of new technology in the background and I don't want to lose you guys. So I'm going to do my best to really show and explain what we're talking about here. So vendor relationship management, it also applies to customers. It applies really to a lot of different facets and areas of your business, but let's focus with our buyer hats on and how we're dealing with our vendors. So contacts and types, okay? You have the ability in Spire to organize contacts and types as well. And we do have a YouTube video on this. If you guys have not subscribed to the Spire YouTube channel, you really should. There's a lot of gems in there. But when we talk about types, we can categorize our vendors in different ways. And like I said, this isn't rocket science. This is just playing around a little bit. And you can always ask your Spire partner to help you with this. User-defined fields are a feature that exists globally throughout Spire and very powerful and can really give you a lot of insight to what kind of data you have. But ways that you might start categorizing your vendors in user-defined fields is perhaps by the type of product. Right now, by looking at the customer code or by looking at the inventory item that you get from this customer that they do plastic or they do wood. I mean, you're very familiar with your database, but we're not talking about that here. We're talking about better ways to organize your data, which means better ways to pull information out of your data, right? So here you are, you've got product types. These are just a few that I've listed here in a user-defined field. You'll notice that I made it mandatory. Garbage in, garbage out, as we know when it comes to data. So if we force people to actually put a piece of data in there, we become more accustomed to those processes. Another way that you can look at that is by rating. If you just look under the product type here, I suggested a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 in this example. have easy numbers or letters if you want in terms of creating a rating scale, but remember that it's internal definitions. These are your internal ways of rating the vendor. Is it an A vendor, a B vendor, a C vendor? Is 10 the best? Is 10 the worst? I mean, this will mean different to you and your relationship. And also your internal lingo, right? Every company has internal lingo. Another element that we added here was classification, which is different than rating, right? So someone should be responsible for evaluating the vendors that you're working with in your organization before they become a supplier, or maybe even on an annual basis. You want to take a look at reviewing your vendors and give them a classification. Is this a preferred vendor? Is it a vendor that is perhaps not preferred and second option? Perhaps you have a different schema that you want to use in terms of classifying your vendors. And then also the risk level. Okay, this is very important. Is this a high risk vendor, a low risk vendor, a medium risk vendor? Ask yourself these questions before you start creating user-defined fields, because again, they have to have meaning within your organization. And think about what you want to retrieve with access from that data, and it'll help you architecturally put that together. And of course, your Spire partner can absolutely help you with that. They're very good at making the best use out of user-defined fields. But let's talk about risk for a vendor, right? What makes a vendor critical for you and your organization? You should ask yourself these 3 questions, right? So if all of a sudden this vendor disappeared for whatever reason, would it cause disruption to the business, right? What kind of disruption would it cause? Would it cause disruption, or is it not a big deal? Okay. Would it impact your customers or just your internal day-to-day processes? Right? We have a variety of different types of vendors. The vendor that supplies your hydro or your electricity, that immediately affects you, ultimately affects your customers, right? To try and differentiate all the different types of vendors that you have and associate whether, again, this impacts you or just your customers or both. And if the worst case scenario happened where this vendor was no longer available, how quick could you replace that vendor? Is it less than a business day? We all know that downtime in the office, downtime in production can cause, problems, right? So if any of these questions you've answered yes to all of them or any of them, really, they could be considered a high risk vendor. And so when you are putting this list together and using these user defined fields, you can easily save a query, create a filter, use the columns that you want to see. Your user defined columns can be seen in the grid of your vendors. Again, this is a global feature in Spire, and you can decide to save that. And if you're doing a vendor review, that really helps. And it just, again, at a glance, is easy to access that kind of information if you set it up right. Contacts. So now we've gone from like the type of vendor it is to contacts within the vendor company, right? And so contact, types can be used throughout Spire. Again, globally, it's not just at a vendor level. You can have contact types for employees, you can have contact types for customers, and you would go ahead and use that to help improve your communications all across the board, whether, again, it's internal roles, internal messages that you want to send, customer invoices or statements for AR, and of course your vendors. This can be done in the company settings section, and there is a contact type tab. There are about 3 generic contacts, 1, 2, and 3 that are in there. That's a carryover from an older version of Spire. So if you see that, that's where that came from. But best practice really says to not use generic contact types. That won't really mean much to you guys. So try to give that some thought in how you put that together. It's important. It's going to help you stay more organized. You might have some policies that, there's vendor sensitive information that you want not everybody to really have access to. You want to easily be able to identify who's who as well. Like, that's the primary decision maker, that's the buyer, that's the salesperson, that's the accounting department, all within one organization. That will help you also make it easier to send emails intended for a specific type of contact, if it's just the accounting, if it's just the salespeople. And you can think of this on both ends, like I said, vendors and customers. It helps you with your analytics too. You can generally see, how many people do we have at this company that we're in contact with. When we're reviewing our vendor relationships, we're analyzing our vendor relationships, that can come in handy. So when you're creating these things, think about them, like I said, beyond just the vendor. Think about all the different ways that this can exist for you, and some tips as to what you should ask yourself when you're setting up this architecturally would be, how do we want to be able to communicate with each different contact type? How do we want to communicate with our employees, our vendors, our customers, that kind of stuff? What kind of analysis would actually be helpful to us to have in terms of how many contacts and classifications for contacts? What does that mean for us in an organization? And how useful is that information? And ask yourself, if you're spending a lot of time looking for contact information in your Outlook or Gmail inbox, or in a network file that you have a profile of a customer on, like, is that information easily accessible to you, or how much time are you spending looking for that? Derek, I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit about expense budgets for vendors, and how users can have some of the stuff in Spire help them. But further, you're going to circle kind of back on this topic a little later on. So why have specific vendor expense budgets, right? Like, I think a lot of organizations have an overall budget where they're looking at the revenue, they're looking at the expenses, they're looking at the assets and the liabilities and all of that good stuff. But vendor budget management actually helps to increase budget accuracy. It actually also helps with those relationships, right? Like, we talk a lot about relationships as we are going through this vendor relationship management thing, and how much money you're spending somewhere, how much money you're wasting somewhere is a very important part of managing those. Overall, helping with your expenses and to reduce those, or if you're looking at growing, potentially increasing some of the expenses that you have with your vendors. So some of the types of expenses that people are not really considering overall as being associated to a vendor expense would be any travel. Sometimes we just have one GL account that we dump all the travel into, but that might be associated to a vendor expense. Maybe we're going and checking out a facility. Maybe they're demonstrating a line of new products that they have for us, and we have to get on a train, a plane, or a bus, or whatever the case may be. Maybe sometimes keeping your team fully educated on a new product line has an expense associated to it. Maybe there's conferences that you attend put on by the vendor, and keeping them educated on that, and that might have an expense associated to it. If there's warranties or insurances associated to that, that might be something that you want to allocate as a part of your vendor expense. Support fees. So think outside the box. It's not just the traditional cost of goods, right? It can be other things that are associated to vendor expense. Ask your Spire partner for help if you're not sure how you can include these in your chart of accounts, where they should live. It's more of an accounting and Spire structure kind of conversation, which we're not getting into today, but having the right data in the right places matters, okay? Spire does have a budget and forecast module. It's a very simple tool to use. It's not overly complicated. Really, you can derive a lot of information from this tool and then further play with it in terms of managing budget in an Excel. There are videos, again, on our YouTube channel on how to use the budgets and forecast module. So you can go ahead and check those out. This isn't a lesson on that, but again, just some concepts here. So in terms of expenses, what I'm looking for, let's say I'm the head of a department, okay, and I want to task someone in my department with setting goals and a budget for the following year for particular vendors. So I'm going to remove the revenue from that view. I'm going to remove the assets and liabilities, and I'm just really going to focus on, all the expenses, which I can tidy up a little later on. I'll want to include last year, this year, and next year, because I want this person to be able to take a look at what we actually spent last year, what we thought we were going to spend last year, what we're thinking we're going to spend this year, and how that's actually coming along. Maybe we've committed to something already for next year as well that we need to think about in our budget as we set gross goals, which Derek and I will talk about a little later on as well. And then, you can drill down on this, or expand it rather, not drill down, but expand it rather, to look at this by month of last year, this year, or next year, or just the totals. And if you do enter in a budget for the total year, Spire's budgets and forecast module is smart enough to be able to divide that up. So if your total amount is divisible by 12 months, it'll go ahead and plot those into the various months for you. So you can, again, check out the YouTube video. There's a lot more information on there, but you have some flexibility in how you want to look at budget, and take this out, export it to Excel, clean it up, take away what you don't want them to see. Maybe you don't want them to see wages. Maybe you do want them to see wages, because labor goes into some of your vendor expenses as well. It's not just a sales thing, right? So export that out to Excel. You can take a good look at it. You can use this tool also to set your goals. There's a nice little growth rate percentage. You can base it just on the expenses on the same year. So this year, what we're spending, and I want to increase that by 5%, because my CEO said you want to have a growth of at least 5%. Okay, so again, really cool tools that allow you to do that. Talk to your Spire partner about it some more. Just back to our grid in terms of looking at our vendors. We've got those vendor classifications, product type, rating, high risk, and whatnot. But we can also now take our transactional kind of history and current transaction status for our vendors, look at last year's purchases, this year's purchases, anything we've committed to next year, what kind of balance do we have owing, and hold that up on a quarterly basis if we want, with the budget that we've been working on, and kind of in a two-step process, allow yourself to evaluate the health of your vendors, your vendor relationships from a budget management perspective. And then if you add, like I had earlier, those ratings, you can definitely make good use of the user-defined fields. Okay, so I have a little question actually for our audience. On a scale of 1 to 10, I hope you guys can see that. Derek, can you see the poll on your side of the screen there?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so after discussing vendor management and vendor relationship management processes, can the audience cast a vote on how you would rate your VRM? Maybe you've learned some tips here since I've been talking with Derek. Perhaps there's a lot of this that you already do. Perhaps you've been inspired. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you think you would do? I hope that you all can see this. I'm not seeing any answers popping in.
I submitted one. So did it come through yet?
No, I haven't seen it, but I'm glad that you submitted one. I would expect, Derek, that you're at like a 10, okay? Because you're really the expert on this. I'm going to go ahead and close that and see if this technology did work. We didn't get very many results. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so that didn't quite work. Not sure if you guys were able to cast a vote or not. Let me see what my backup is telling me. Oh, she could see it. Well, I hope that you have a good VRM process in place and that it is working well for you. So Derek, I want to kind of turn the floor over to you now, and let's talk about customer service in a VRM. Okay. Oh, I'm getting a report. Sorry, that 5. Most people have rated their VRM at a 5 out of 10. So
Okay.
that's helpful. That's helpful, guys. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. CRM used not just for sales, not just for vendor management, Derek. Let's talk about customer service a little bit. When we talk about customer service in a tool like that, there's kind of mirroring of what we've been talking about from the vendor relationship side, but taking notes, we can take some notes in Spire, we can share those communications in Spire, we can do a lot of emailing through Spire, but talk to me a little bit about how important it is to have strong internal communication.
Well, I mean, I would say it's probably critical these days to the growth of a lot of companies. If we look at, let's say, the last 3 years, 4 years with COVID and everyone having to pivot to home, the traditional step away from your desk and walk down the hall and talk to somebody else, that went away. everything was moved to chat, whether that be Slack or Teams or some of the other components. So internal communications, it pivoted drastically. So being and having that consolidated within, within, let's say, the vendor record and the discussions had, and, talking about turnover staff. If, let's say, employee A was dealing as the procurement manager with the vendor, and then they leave and employee B now takes over that job. Well, wouldn't it be great to know the conversations, the negotiated pricing, the terms, the rates, the delivery times and the commitments, because you talked about supply chain issues. If you were able to work out with your vendors and get a commitment for X amount provided over a set period of time, well, that helps you with your customers for the commitments you offer to them. So having all those internal communications consolidated, and being able to not have that rely on or be living in an individual's head or just through the spoken word back and forth in a meeting, but rather in a digital format is huge.
It helps the staff too, really, right? Like, aside
absolutely.
from turnover, like, as much as I have an amazing memory, it's impossible for me to remember every single detail of every single conversation, of every order, of every item, of, like, we're only human, right? So
well, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, pen and paper, has always been a really big go-to for a lot of people.
Yeah. And it still is, folks. Like, no joke,
exactly.
It still is, right? But it doesn't mean that one has to replace the other necessarily, right? I think what we're talking about is housing everything in one place, right? As opposed to different silos where different pieces of data exist, right, Derek?
Well, exactly. If we're looking at, team meetings, if we're looking at emails, internal emails, even if we're looking at all that discussion, having that in a tool like a CRM that does VRM as well, is critical, because you can essentially reduce those email threads that go back and forth.
Right.
Because again, you're utilizing tools that are built into that platform that would allow you to achieve the same result, but keep it all in one spot. So you are building a more well-rounded understanding and picture of, whether it be the vendor or the customer.
Right.
Right.
And then people communicate with us in a variety of different ways, right? So when we talk about either orders being submitted or other means of communications that are not order driven, we're capturing that in emails, we're capturing that in documents, or if you're providing a service, there's tickets that get submitted, right? Sales get sales queries, and all of that can be used as key performance indicators, right? So talk to me a little bit about how important it is to capture all of these in different ways, and the importance of, having that information assigned to somebody, right, within a system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, and you're absolutely right. There is no single way that that communications or data is shared. It's coming across many different ways. And when we get to the omni-channel section later on, I mean, that just further proves that point. But yeah, I mean, being able to consolidate that information and then share it, consume things like your purchase orders, and having them in the system that is also then, including with your sales team, documentation, contracts, agreements, quotes, even if you're doing procurement, right? If you're project-based sales and you have to go out and you're sourcing products for that sale and working with the sales team, those people on the VRM side have to engage with the vendors. So sharing that information and getting that back and forth between the two teams is, can be quite critical. And working through those components. Yeah, absolutely.
So this must be what we're looking at now on our screen, a bit of an example of what we've just gone over within the integration tool that you provide, right? So we've got a submission form. Tell us a little bit, the submission, how we're receiving information. But I see some really interesting stats here: response time, customer happiness. Tell us a little bit about what we're looking at, Derek.
Yeah, so the submission form is, I would probably say, is pretty self-explanatory. So the ability to just collect data and inquiries or items from whether they be vendors or customers, looking at your list of customers and what you're doing with them, or how much you currently owe them, and prioritizing. But then, yeah, if we're looking at the service side, when we look at things like your average response time, how long it takes you to resolve, your customer happiness, those are all things related to tickets. So, those typically are derived from your customer. However, at the same time, that does a lot of times have a direct correlation back to the vendor. If there's a problem with a customer's product, it's not working, it's malfunctioning, that's maybe not on you, that's on the vendor. And so having that and tracking those incidents, if you will, also gives you the ability to give accurate reporting back to your vendors, which, we would have to assume they all want to hear.
And rating the vendors, like I talked about earlier in our system, right? So if we can see how many product issues, and not just by remembering how many bad calls we got at the customer service side of things, right? But if we can actually track the numbers there, then it'll help us give an evaluation. A couple of other,
sorry, just one last point on that too. And the other side too, with the ticketing, everyone always thinks that is incidents or problems, but we do get inquiries. You will sometimes see questions. So even things such as product improvements, right? Spire does it. Everyone does that, right? So a lot of times that a lot of those improvements and features tend to derive from a customer needing something and filing a ticket because they couldn't figure out how to do it, which then kind of gets the balls working. Gets the
very good point. So very good point. So if I'm hearing you correctly, what we're sharing with our friends in the audience today is that the incoming message doesn't always come through the right medium, if you will. So someone might have a tech support issue, let's say, or a service support issue, and it's going to come in through an order form or a contact us page versus a ticket. Or again, a request for an improvement on something is going to come through as a ticket as opposed to a customer service call, or so organizing your data where it belongs on your end so that you can properly tally up and analyze it later on. Very important. A couple of other aspects that we talk about, Derek, in terms of customer services is workflow and automation. When we say the word automation, people kind of, do I get rid of an employee? Is that what that's going to do for me? And the answer is there's always going to need to be a human being to make a decision on the other side of your machine here. So, we can automate things to make our lives a little bit easier. And Derek, and I think you'll agree, you shared with me that these automated responses that are timely and take some workload off of people don't have to sound robotic. They don't have to sound automated, right? Like,
Absolutely.
Give me an example of maybe the worst automated message you've ever seen before.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably, submitting something, trying to travel, and there was an issue with Air Canada, and they sent through a ticket, and it was your service is important to us. We'll get back to you shortly. And then 2 days later, still sitting there saying, what the hell was the response on this?
Yeah, I've had the same thing. Yeah,
those robotic, no emotion kind of responses are definitely the worst ones.
Yeah, for sure. And return merchandise authorization. So this is an important part of a lot of businesses, a lot of them, especially in the wholesale distribution area, where you're managing your return. So you're not just able to track it and perhaps submit it back to inventory. I mean, that's a very important part as well. But really being able to analyze your RMAs, right? Cost savings, like I said, better inventory management. But give me an example of how that's going to help with your analysis and your vendor relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, looking at RMAs, and the idea of even workflows, a lot of times as we work with companies, we'll find that, the RMA really should be the last course of action. So the steps involved, the sequence, right? Here's an example of one for like an opportunity. But the idea of reviewing and assessing what a customer's doing and what the issues are with the products. Again, vendors aren't just going to want to hear, hey, your product's broken. They're going to want to know what you did to potentially try to resolve it, right? The first line of defense. Yeah. So, understanding a process and having your team know the steps to take, whether that be a new employee, right? We talk about employee turnover and the idea of having new staff coming on. If they have steps and procedures they have to go through, especially if it's more of a technical product, that's even more so, that they can follow, then it really does allow for consistency, which then gets back into reporting. So if there are actual issues that we do have to report back to our vendors on for two reasons: one, we don't want to sell a defective product, and two, We want the vendor to know so they can improve their product, which ultimately is going to help us with our sales.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that, we are following the necessary steps and we're not shortchanging ourselves or the customer or even the vendor.
Right. So I want to go ahead and ask another poll here. It's more about your customer service, understanding that, your customer service does help you with your vendor relationship management stuff. My friends in the audience, would you share with me if you would say that your customer service process could use some improvement? Yes, we could do this better. Well, everything is a work in progress. Or no, we're actually very proud of our process and that's great. Amanda, I'm going to ask you in the background to just kind of keep an eye on that for me, and let me know if you see some answers rolling in. The beauty of live sessions, you guys. That's great. Let's see. And so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here and see if this has worked out. Amanda, can you tell me what you see the results to be, please? See if you guys are very confident in your customer service process, or if you are thinking that you could definitely improve that. I'll go ahead and carry on here and wait to hear back. So when we talk about setting growth targets, there's the customer sales side, there's the customer service, there's the vendor management. So when we set goals, do we set our vendor management? Oh, just to backtrack here, 50%, everything is working very well. We're very confident. And no, 19% says it's absolutely perfect. We don't need any help. So some people kind of need some help. Half the audience needs some help. Vendor management goals. Does that come before setting sales goals? Like we can only sell the products as good as we get them, or we can only set sales goals based on, our vendors. Like which orders does this come in, Derek? Like it's a chicken or the egg thing, and it's kind of like a continuous. What do we look at first? Our vendor relationships or our sales, or is it a simultaneous thing? Tell me what you think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, the chicken and the egg analogy is probably the best one for this, because it really does depend upon the company and how they operate. We talked about vendor in VRM and the idea of high risk vendors. Well, if you have a lot of dependency on certain vendors, well, then maybe you should be managing your budgets and what your targets are based upon what your vendor can actually supply you with, right? If there's master distribution rights, et cetera, and you don't have options, or you're just really tethered to one person, that can really hinder your ability to say, I want to do a 20% increase this year if the vendor can only provide you with a 10% capacity. So in those scenarios, sometimes you are required to do that. And on the flip side, if you have that flexibility, that versatility, which hopefully most people can get, then you can set your targets, and then sharing that with the vendor is always crucial, because that gives them the ability to then understand what's next on their list.
Got some tips here for our friends in the audience, Derek, from you about what to consider when they are setting their target. So talk to us a little bit about that, please.
Well, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of companies will say we want to hit a 10% increase this year, but the question that we always ask is, okay, fine, well, how do you want to do that? Right. And so just a 10% is a very generic term. And, as you talked about in the budgeting and the forecasting side of Spire, you get into the expense level, to the GL level. So we look at that, as well from the side of saying, maybe we have to look at that from the product lines, right? So looking at your vendors, who can supply what consistency, what kind of terms you're getting, what your margins are, and then also what product lines are more important. So to sell $1 million worth of product line A, which gives you 10% margin, or, $500,000 of product line B, which gives you a 50% margin. Well, which one do you want to do, right? So it's not just overall, we just want to increase our sales. We really need to look at those pieces, and as I said, if you have your Spire budgets and you have the components in there, taking that data is critical, because it's doing a lot of those basic calculations for you. But then mapping that or tying that in with CRM to say, okay, fine, those product lines with this customer, these are the numbers I want to hit. And, yes, we'll talk a little bit about sales right now, but if we look at that idea as, okay, fine, this customer, I want to increase that product line by 10% because that's what they did. This is what they did last year versus this year,
Right.
what we're shooting for. Then the CRM tools are what you actually can use to get there, right? Your communications consolidation, all those other, fun pieces that get into it.
And it essentially will also help you again back into your vendor reviews on your relationship management and your rating of them and risking, right? If you're basing your growth on a certain amount of sales that is highly dependent on a particular product, that becomes a high risk vendor, right? So something to think about there. This is a nice little dashboard that we're looking at. I think it really encompasses what you were just talking about in terms of, target achievements and actually being able to have that data at your fingertips. I like how you've got Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble. I was a big Flintstone fan as a kid. Just very quickly, tell me about this dashboard that we're looking at.
Yes. So this is a way of, essentially showing some of those targets, right? Putting that into functions that coupling with the CRM, tools that are already available, saying, okay, fine, if I have a target of 450 for this quarter, here are the opportunities, here's the work I have to do to get it, right? We can't just sit back and assume the customer is just going to increase their sales magically by 10% with you because they feel like it. Right. There's work to be put in. That's what salespeople are all about.
Yeah.
So knowing that and then seeing your targets and simple KPIs and indicators related to how many deals you have and what your revenue is, how many leads are in the system, right? And how many have you generated, right? Do you have to go out and hunt? Are they coming to you? Is it inbound, outbound marketing? These are all things that go towards those targets, right? Which all rolls back to the vendors because the vendors need to know those targets a lot of times too.
And you could have a similar dashboard that is reporting on the KPIs of your vendors as well, and then kind of do a comparison with these two and see they should kind of speak to each other, kind of fit into each other for that proper growth strategy to work. Let's talk about managing ratings very quickly here. We're not talking about how customers rate you. We're talking about internal ratings and what that means. So revenue versus profit. Derek, tell me about these tips that you've got here. How should we be managing ratings on these various bullet points in front of you?
Well, again, I reverted back to the growth targets idea there. If we're looking at revenue versus profit, and that $1 million sales at 10% margin versus the 500,000 at 50% margin, those are always factors to consider because it's maybe not the biggest, sexiest looking dollar amount on the bottom line, but if it adds more to your profit margin, well then that's really the focus, right? And then buying frequencies. If we have one client who buys a $500,000 purchase once a year, well, that's great. We want that. But how does that help cash flow, right? So when we're setting ratings on our customers or even the vendors we're dealing with, and we're only getting, purchases a couple times a year, it's also very important to know that because that goes into cash flow, which is a lesser talked about, but equally important component.
Absolutely.
And then, product lines, growth potential, what are you looking at? If you're managing your vendors and what they're doing, or if you're managing your customers and what they're buying, do the product lines that you're carrying right now fit with your future plans, right? Are you, in the automotive industry, you'd have to pivot from combustion engines into electric because that's been slated. Like there's all kinds of things that come through, maybe in your control, maybe outside that you want to look at, right? So they all come into consideration when you do ratings. It's not just, okay, fine, this guy does $1 million with us a year, so he's important to me. And that's a big factor, but there's so many other things that go into it.
So in earlier slides where I showed how we created a user-defined field, for example, and you could rate on a scale of 1 to 5, or you could rate on a scale of 1 to 10. I talked a little bit about defining what that means to you as an organization and as an organization as a whole, because this is shared data, right? And so what a salesperson would rate someone, a vendor, as, because they have to maybe order, they're in charge of purchasing as well, versus how accounting might feel about paying that vendor, right? Could be two very different things. So important to be on the same page, having that company alignment in terms of what it all means. Right.
Well, exactly. I mean, it truthfully shouldn't be just one person. It should be a group. And that's also where having CRMs and, with the VRM component, the whole team technically should be in the system because then they all have access to it. Right. It all kind of comes back to the same idea. Looking at things.
Nice
Yeah.
visual there in terms of gathering all of this data, right? So now we've talked about the architecture of how you would set this up in a system, whether it's Spire or a more in-depth CRM that helps you with this, right? And so now you've got all this data, you can derive analytics from it, but let's talk about turning data into actual meaningful substance here and taking that and having action items with it, because how many of us look at a dashboard and go, okay, like we wanted this dashboard for so long, now we finally have it, and it's like, okay, now what? But what do you do with that data to make it meaningful, Derek?
Well, I mean, I think it is really, when you look at the KPIs, and everyone loves that term KPIs. And you said at the beginning, there's so many acronyms and letters getting get thrown around today. Key performance indicators. Looking at those, it's easy for somebody to just say, okay, fine, I want to know what my sales are at for the month compared to last year. Well, that's good, but you have to look at that and say, okay, fine, if I'm going to understand what that is, what kind of levers can I adjust there to, let's say, improve upon that, right? Do I need to light a little bit of a fire under the sales team? Do I need to increase my marketing spend to get more business coming through the door? Do I need to go back and negotiate with my vendors on my pricing to bring my margins up so that I don't have to increase my sales per se, but I can still hit that bottom line target of increased profitability?
Visuals are very helpful, right? So when we look at the data analyzed in a way that our eyes are easily drawn to it, that's great. And you can do a sales pipeline, but I believe in a CRM, you can call a pipeline whatever you want to call it, right? You can create all kinds of pipelines, right?
You can do anything really with it. I always joke as a salesperson myself, I'm like, you know what? Salespeople are visual people. They like pretty flashy things. So having that on the screen is always a good draw. But you're right, the data underneath it is so important. And doing those pipelines, those flows, et cetera, is always critical to it.
Yeah, we got about 5 minutes, so we're kind of just going to go through this part a little bit quickly here. So one of the things we wanted to address was omnichannel sales. So omni, coming from the Latin word omnis, if you all remember from your language courses back in the day, everything, all encompassing, every kind of it thing. So omnichannel sales essentially means multiple platforms in where you sell your products. And Derek, as we continue to grow in this very technology oriented world that we live in today, we're no longer taking orders just over the phone or walk-ins or emails. Even like email is even almost antiquated at this point in terms of how people place orders. Is this a trend? Do you think that social selling, text messages, chatbots on websites, do you think this is a trend, or do you think it's just going to grow?
I think truthfully it's going to grow. I mean, I can't see how it would. You look at a generation, the demographics, the younger as they move into these roles, that's just what they've been used to, right? So it's just digital is way more involved these days, and it's just going to continue to grow.
TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, like even Facebook's considered kind of old now, right? So,
well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, Chat GPT is going to be a big thing too, right? So those things are all going to come into play. They all, there's ways they're already talking about tying that in with omnichannel and, chats and interfacing.
That's a whole other episode, Chat GPT. That's a whole other episode in the podcast series. But so keeping all of this in one space, because can you imagine if you had to log into your Instagram, log into your Facebook, log into your e-store, your web store, check with the chat bot, check with the phone, check with there's so many things coming at us that an advantage of having a CRM, both on the vendor side and the customer side, is having all of that in one space. And this is a very nice a very nice diagram of how your solution manages that. Last poll, ladies and gentlemen, I haven't had huge success with these polls. I apologize. We're going to try again. How many of you are doing omni-channel sales? I think you can select more than one of these. If you could do that, just as we wrap up here, are you predominantly taking phone calls, emails, walk-ins? Maybe you have a warehouse that has a storefront to it. Are you active on Facebook? Any kind of social media, like we mentioned before. Trade shows, also people sell live at trade shows, and the world is opening up a little bit more, and people are doing trade shows. Or maybe there's another method that we're not thinking about or haven't mentioned here today. But share with us exactly what you use for omni-channel sales. Maybe you don't. And go ahead and end it just because we are running a bit short on time, and Amanda will give me those results in just a little bit. I appreciate you guys taking part in this. Derek, I just want to go over a little bit quickly, recap what we've talked about here today and what the bottom line is. So CRMs are for more than just sales. We've clearly discussed that and gone through that a variety of different ways. 96% taking phone call orders, 93% email orders, 59% of our audience are still doing walk-ins, website e-commerce 90%, 48% in social, and 31% in trade shows. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. Those are interesting numbers. Phone calls are still the winner there. So more than just sales, think about your processes and how those processes can be improved using Spire in some of the clever ways. I gave you some very basic ideas there that I hope have inspired you. And again, please talk to your Spire consultant about how you can use that more. But if you need a higher level of that and you like those dashboard reports that we were looking at that Derek shared with us today, and you want to be able to incorporate tighter vendor relationships, customer management, sales, all in one kind of a place that is not solely based on the financial transactions that take place in Spire, you should think about a CRM and using that beyond just for sales. Where can you improve? Ratings, how do you rate your vendors? How do you rate your customers? How you drive meaningful data? That's important because otherwise it's just numbers on a screen, what you do with that. And then kind of omni-channel sales, right? So, you know, if you do want to talk to Derek Fitzpatrick at GoIntegrations a little bit more, contact your Spire partner. They have Derek's contact info, and they also understand your business model, and they can speak that same language, software language with Derek there. And Derek will also be able to further meet with you after with your Spire partner. Derek, thank you so much for joining us today. We are exactly on the nose, 12 o'clock. Your expertise was fantastic. You really brought a lot of great ideas of what else one needs to consider in using a CRM and not just the traditional methods. So thanks for your time again with us here.
Yes.
And
thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, you can see our next event on our Spire events page on our website. The next podcast style webinar will be Wednesday, March 15th, 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Our guest will be Peter Wright from Spire Assist. And we're going to talk about financial report writing freedom. Peter has a fantastic tool that is fully integrated into Spire to really help do WYSIWYG reporting. If you don't know what WYSIWYG is, look it up and join us next month. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.